Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Karadina Sale with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the New York University Silver School of Social Work's Silver Institute. And I would like to welcome you to today's webinar called Narrative Therapy with Families. I don't know how many of you have heard of narrative therapy, but it's kind of new to me and I'm really excited by it. Narrative therapy is client-driven and a type of experiential therapy that helps to empower people by separating their identity from their experiences. It helps to remove blame and shame, and as a result, individuals are able to reauthor their stories and reestablish their experiences in the here and now. Through the use of narrative therapy, individuals and families are able to better understand themselves and recognize how the language of their stories shapes their lives and identity. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Chris Hoff, who is the founder and the executive director of the California Family Institute in Southern California. CFI is a nonprofit organization that was established as a community counseling center that provides desperately needed low-cost counseling services for the community and for the development of research and training for those interested in narrative therapy approaches. Before we get started, to orient everyone to our Zoom webinar system so you know how to participate in today's event. I'm sure you all have been here before, but if not, you are placed on mute to avoid any background noises. If you have any technical issues, please just chat our host, Vanessa, who will be able to assist you. And please submit any questions you have along the way. We will have time for a Q&A at the end. So Vanessa and I will be collecting those throughout our conversation today and hearing from Dr. Hoff. So please chat in any questions you have. Thank you again for being here. And Dr. Hoff, I will pass it off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kara. And hello, everybody. Thanks for joining for us for this kind of quick webinar. I want to just maybe start by thanking CTAC and Kara and Vanessa for the invitation to come share about, a practice, narrative therapy that I love, it's a really rich practice. We have an hour here today, so I want to qualify that. You're just going to get a little taste of like a sliver of narrative therapy. Narrative therapy is a very rich practice. And as a matter of fact, you're kind of going to get Chris Hoff's version of narrative therapy. Maybe if there was a different speaker today, they might focus on some other aspects of narrative therapy when working with families, but you're going to kind of get my version today. So I encourage you all, if this is something that sparks some interest on your part, and we will provide some resources at the end, but to explore more and to kind of learn from all different kinds of folks, and but there's just a lot out there. And so with that, I think we'll just get going. The agenda for today is, we just kind of did our introductions, and I'm going to show us, there'll be a couple of videos today in the work, and I'm going to kind of set the foundation, share a little bit about the theories or the approaches that guide my work. I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of Michael White's work around statement of position maps, and we're going to be working with one of his maps. There's a bunch of maps in narrative practice, and some people use them, some people don't. I tend to be a maps person. I'm a Vygotskian. I like providing a framework in the beginning for folks that are new to the practice to kind of maybe have something to hold on to, but to eventually let go of. So, and then we're going to leave some time for Q&A. I hope you have a lot of questions. I do like questions, and so yeah. So, quick question for you now, for all of you. This is our let's chat moment, but in a quick show, does anybody familiar or working with narrative or get any? I know they don't do a lot of training in it in graduate programs. If you do, you might get a week of it in a theories class, but okay, a little bit.
No's, a lot of no's.
Okay.
In the context of TFCBT. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, using the narrative, the trauma narrative,
right.
Just slightly different, but yeah, I see what people are saying.
And
Yes.
I'll talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Heard about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm also curious about what are some of your biggest challenges in practicing, or are you practicing family therapy? Kara and I were having a conversation before we started the webinar, and it was around, a lot of there's just isn't a lot of family work happening. There's kind of this movement now that we kind of do the individual thing. If somebody comes in, usually there's an identified patient, which I'll talk about, and they kind of get split off into some individual work. But I'm wondering how many people are actually still practicing family therapy, or okay, sometimes, okay. Funding, yeah. What are some of the challenges you think? Funding is a challenge. Hmm. Got another MFT in the room.
Deficit of on EBPs for it. There aren't a lot of family focused EBPs. It sounds like some people are saying.
And that probably affects funding, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Program structure and expectations are a challenge. Parents want quick results on their children's
Well,
behavior.
everybody wants quick results. That's
Mhm, mhm.
that's the culture we live in right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for all that. So I'm going to go in for some of you might, the structural family therapists in the room might remember or you know of Salvador Minuchin. And I'm sure in your grad programs, when you did have your family therapy class, you I'm sure learned about Salvador Minuchin. He's kind of a legend in the family therapy field. But I wanted to start off the presentation with a critique, and he had a critique of narrative when it was kind of coming onto the scene, and narrative at that time was kind of viewed as something that was the person's not the problem's the problem, and problems are created in the larger social cultural context. And so Salvador Minuchin's critique was, well, where is the family in narrative family therapy? He thought the focus was too much on like discourse and the larger social cultural context. And I think, the field is now moving to, you're seeing it, especially in trauma work and stuff like that, moving into like how the larger cultural social context does create problems in people's lives. But at that time, it was like, well, is the family getting lost in that focus, right? And that was Salvador Minuchin's critique. And so I'm here to try to respond to that critique, so you could see that, like, well, actually, we do look at the macro, but we absolutely look at the micro. And in that effort, well, I'm going to, well, before we get there, I did some co-research videos with some families, and I'm going to show you just small snippets of that so you can see. But what is narrative family therapy? Well, I think we can all agree we organize our lives around story, right? And even if you're not a narrative therapist, say you're a trauma therapist, say you're a somatic therapist, EMDR, it doesn't matter. Whenever you ask somebody, say you're somatic, where do you feel that in your body? They're going to tell you a story, right? Or when somebody comes to you and sits on your couch, if that's how you do it, and you ask them, why are you here? They're going to tell you a story, right? And so, I think we can all, I hope, can all get behind the idea that we do organize our lives, our careers, our relationships, our families. We all organize them around story. And the originators of narrative therapy believe that the stories we continually tell each other about ourselves are the most powerful influences on the ways we understand our world, our lives, and they very much define our identities, right? But these stories, unfortunately, are often distorted by unrecognized and unexamined social norms. So why is narrative family therapy important? Well, I'm going to propose in this, talk that the narrative family therapy is different, but in a lot of different ways. But one prominent difference is how it views families as the experts in their own lives. That families are multi-storied, and unfortunately, they are at times captured by problem stories that will subjugate or blind them to their own wisdom, skills, and knowledge about what's best for families. And an example of this, is that there's not an IP, for example, an identified patient, which is kind of a traditional family therapy term for, somebody that's kind of the identified patient, but that, and the idea that the family is not the problem is the problem. And narrative family therapy, if I were going to kind of boil it down to anything, Michael White, one of the originators, co-creators of family therapy, said that narrative therapy really is about restoring personal agency, and I think that's what narrative family therapy is. It's definitely about restoring personal agency to families in the face of problems. Okay. And with that, I work with families, right? So several years back, I went and decided to do a little co-research with some of the families that I worked with. I'll show you a couple quick clip of a couple families, and then I'll finish with a family at the end of this. But just kind of asking them what was different about the work, but also what their recommendations were to family therapists. And so let's watch a little video. It'll be a quick 3-minute video or something.
I guess I'm looking for your wisdom about what you found really effective in family therapy and what you'd want to let other therapists know.
I like knowing that what I had to say was valued, that I could talk without, so much fear, at least, of being interrupted or of feeling like I wasn't heard. It made me feel like no one person was more important, at least, in session.
Wow.
Sometimes, especially, well, there's been times when we just talked among ourselves and that Chris was just like the
listener.
Witness.
Well, I want to say liaison
witness.
or something. Yeah, it's like it wasn't directed directly at the therapist, but there's been other times when we're just talking to the therapist and we don't want their input sometimes. But so it happens both ways, and yeah, sometimes when I felt more safe if I talked in front of the therapist. I felt more safe to share my genuine feelings with another party there, and that they could help to validate them, and they could help the other person to hear what I was trying to communicate, because it wasn't always, instead of them being defensive or not being able to receive my thoughts. And so that's when it's nice to have a therapist or a third party just to help mediate.
What do you think, Cody? What gave you the space to kind of have a different kind of conversation about? I mean, you've heard about grades for probably a long time.
I got over it. I just got over being like a stubborn, cocky kid. It was kind of getting old. It's just not my thing anymore.
So was it more taking a look at what some of these effects were of being, or that stubborn, cocky kid?
Yeah, because that was just creating more cons and pros, and that was just not weighing out good.
So you were getting a good look at cons as opposed to pros.
Yeah.
Okay. And you were able to kind of say, this boat's sinking, I think is the way you described it.
Yeah, the boat was definitely sinking.
Okay. Okay. All right. Anything else you'd want to leave with?
In previous sessions with other family therapists, I've gotten phone calls about 5 minutes after he was there on an individual session that they threw him out because he had a bad attitude. And somehow we've been able to transition that into communicating and haven't had those issues.
Wow, you were getting thrown out of sessions? Yeah, nice work. Okay.
So I think I do believe that it has to do with his kind of overall experience through this program.
All right.
That has helped.
Any final words, Cody?
I don't know, to all the therapists, don't attack the kids because it's not always their fault, and that just makes it even worse.
All
So,
right. Sound advice.
yeah.
So thank you for that, Vanessa. Yeah, who's throwing a kid out of session? Melanie, it happens probably a lot more than you think. And somebody actually had a quote too. I just want to kind of acknowledge this about like kind of being curious about the sitting arrangement. And I know there's certain models or lenses that might look at that. In narrative therapy, would be cautious about kind of interpreting that kind of thing. We try to kind of set aside interpretations and prescriptions in particular ways. And we would be curious though, if that's something you can be curious about, maybe asking questions about something to that effect. So, and hopefully in the video, it's short, there's longer videos and they had interesting things to say. But, one of the themes in that short clip that came out for me was that, about narrative therapy attending to power, right? And maybe I'll talk about that when I talk about some of the theories, but how in narrative therapy we're interested in attending to power and power in families and how power operations are operating in family. Narrative therapy is a very rich um, philosophically guided project where the originators were definitely informed by folks like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and those kinds of things. If everything from looking at societal norms critically to deconstruction, which we'll talk about a little bit too. But and like I said, narrative is a rich practice, very philosophically informed, and some of the things that kind of inform my work are post-oppositional thought, Dr. Anna Louise Keating, relational interviewing, which is a way of externalizing the relationship and hopefully avoiding blame and shame and those kinds of things. And that's been influenced by Stephen Madigan, a longtime narrative therapist, and Larry Zucker, a narrative therapist here in Los Angeles. And an activism through collaboration framework. I co-authored a paper with Jay D'Arrigo around examining therapist power when trying to do social justice work. And I think you might find that interesting if that's interesting to you. And we looked at a couple of different ways of doing that. And I kind of think I fall in more of an activism through collaboration framework, which I'll talk about. And then of course, Michael White's statement of position maps. So what is post-oppositional thought? One of the central premises of post-oppositional practice is really about holding contradictory ideas in one space. I think we're losing our skills to do that, but we're in a world now where we absolutely, I think, need to do that. And it's about not situating one position over another, even if such a position aligns best with my own personal and philosophical positions. The situating the work with a post-oppositional lens draws me into intentionally holding space for commonalities that exist within perceived contradictions. Some additional traits that guide my work around here is a desire to be entirely and at times paradoxically inclusive, to seek and create complex commonalities and alliances for change, and acknowledgement, and whenever possible, acceptance of paradox, contradiction, multiplicity, intellectual humility, an open-minded, optimistic, flexible approach. And the idea that, really the preposition is that guilt and blame are not useful, but accountability is. We are very interested in relational accountability in narrative family work. I need to probably get moving here. In relational interviewing, this is about externalizing the relationship. This aligns with a post-oppositional stance because it abandons a focus on the individuals in the conflict and instead makes inquiries about what made up the moral character of the relationship prior to the onset of the current conflict or problems, or what are the values that have been that were grounding or guiding to the family. So the relational interviewing stance positions the therapist to better understand the dilemma, dreams, hopes, and ambitions of a family and what's obscuring them. And here are some examples. You can screenshot that or whatever if you're interested in, but these are examples of relational interviewing questions with families. I'd be curious, maybe if you read a few of them, if you maybe might comment, like, what do you imagine what it might do, how people might experience these kinds of questions as a family. What does the family need right now to achieve its dream? What is obscuring the intentions? What abilities have slipped away from the family? What gives you hope that you can give the family relationship what it is asking for? How is this family still important to you despite the struggle? What about this family has withstood the struggle? You know, what is coming forward in those kinds of questions? What are those questions kind of inquiring about? I can't read your whole comment, Melanie. Okay, activism through collaborating framework. This is kind of how I approach, you know, things like attending to power and all that kind of stuff. Um, this is really caution regarding social education. We're careful not to do psychoed in narrative family therapy, right? There's a long history of instant psychology, you know, that kind of interpreting you're this or you're that, or that's kind of this attachment thing, or that's that. And you're seeing it now on TikTok and Instagram and all that stuff, that kind of instant psychology. We're also cautious about doing instant sociology. We don't want to replicate a lot of those forms. We're very interested in privileging the client lead. I would bring critical ideas into therapeutic conversation when appropriate by making the private public, like what I might be thinking, but I'm not doing it from a kind of an expert stance or this is the truth or authority stance. I'm trying to check in with them if that might be working. And of course, you know, utilizing deconstruction, looking for the absent but implicit in what's happening. Therapists who embrace an activism through collaborating framework challenge dominant practices by refraining from social education and consciousness raising, ultimately foregrounding the relational lens. And we're very careful not to use our power in the therapist role to impose or colonize our ideas about what's happening, even if we think they're very progressive, right? So let's get to the statement of position map. I guess before I get into the map, I should probably say something about how I like to structure conversations with families. And I learned this from Jill Friedman and Jean Combs in their couples work, how you try to interview one family member at a time while the rest can witness. They're like an outsider witness group. So people don't have to worry about responding or being defensive or those kinds of things. So I'm very interested in interviewing one person at a time. I think you heard that from the families too, that they felt like they were heard and understood. And I think that's really, really important. But oftentimes when it kind of gets out of control, and I know you've all experienced that, a lot of people don't feel heard or controlled and they're left feeling kind of hopeless in those situations. So that's how I like to structure the work. And this is the framework, you know, kind of, I'm going to say this is the framework that guides the initial interview of the people in the family when they're coming to sit down with me, okay? And a statement of position map, according to Michael White, consists of 4 stages. First one is basically negotiation of an experience near non-structural definition of the problem, which basically means how are we going to name the problem, right? And I'll get on that. Stage 2, mapping the effects of the externalized problem on the young person. In the second family, you had me remember, I asked him about the effects, learning the effects of the cons versus the pros, and that had an effect on him. He was able to see how these things were affecting himself and those around him. And then we do an evaluation of the effects. This is important because we're wanting to make sure we're talking about the right problem. Is it okay that these things are doing this to you? And if they're okay with it, then maybe we're not talking about the right problem. If they're not okay with it, that leads us to stage 4, and that's when we justify it. Why is it not okay? And those kinds of questions will lead us into an alternative story, a counter story to a problem story. So how do we listen? Oftentimes people come to California Family Institute, I tell them we're going to teach you a couple of things. You're going to learn a new language because you're going to learn externalizing language, but you're also going to learn how to listen differently and how you're going to listen to problems. And one of the things I'm really interested in, I literally love about narrative practice, is this idea of double listening or listening for the absent but implicit in the stories that are being told to you. And I'll get a little bit more into that. And it's absolutely driven by curiosity, and we're very careful about taking notes of the client's actual words and using their language in the work that we're doing. So what is double listening? Double listening is basically listening in a way that when somebody's telling you a problem story, this comes from Derrida. This is kind of deconstructive theory, right? That there's a text, there's always a text under the text, right? And that when somebody's telling you, somebody can't tell you a problem story about hopelessness unless they have some vision of hope. And so, and you can't know, so, you can't tell a story of despair unless you've had some experience of joy. And so we're always listening for the other thing, that's the text under the text. And that's in narrative circles, that's called, listening for the absent but implicit, but also double listening. And it's really, really helpful because it gives us space if we're not just taking for granted the problem story, we're hearing in the problem story resistances, hopes, wishes for something different, those kinds of things that will give us space to do work. So externalizing is very important in narrative practice, externalizing language. This is a way of moving problems from like some internalized description to giving it a little bit of space so we can take a look at it, a more nuanced look at problems, and we do this and it's not, I like to say it's not a language trick. It's not a kind of an intervention. It's just a way of thinking about the world and how problems operate on people in the world. And the way we do this is, but we do like to turn problems into nouns. And in that way, we can kind of get a better look at a more nuanced look. I will give some example. Well, like just turning depression to the depression, when the depression comes up, even that simple change in language takes it from an internalized description to maybe something that is a little more fluid, and that there is maybe some personal agency to be found in that. So, and then we're very much about the second stage is mapping the effects of the problem. So let's say perfection, the perfection that shows up in people's lives, right? You're not a perfectionist, but perfection operates on you, right? So that's the naming. And there's something liberatory. I forgot to say this part. There's something very liberatory about people letting them use their own language. I bet you'll find out if you try to do that, if you ask them to, what would you call that? What would you name that problem? That kind of thing. You're going to find that they all have interesting and oftentimes creative names for the problems that they're struggling with. And there's something very liberatory in that. When they get to use their own language, they get to name their own problems rather than us naming the problems for them. So we're always trying to do that if we can. We will help if some people are having a hard time articulating such a problem, but that's very important. But anyway, so once we get a problem named, we're interested in mapping its effects. What have been the effects of perfection in the person's lives? Maybe perfection was something, there's a lot of helpers in here. I'm sure a lot of you have been through grad school and beyond. And I'm sure maybe I'm going to make an assumption, but maybe some of you have had some relationship with perfection, right? That's what allowed you to be successful in the endeavors that you've been successful in. But oftentimes perfection then can, when it moves outside of its boundaries and it moves into your relationships, then it can become very problematic, for example. So we're very interested in mapping and taking a nuanced look at like how perfection might be operating, what domains of life, where does it operate and where doesn't it operate? That's a unique outcome. Why isn't it showing up over there? What are you doing that keeps it at bay in that area? What is its history? A question I really love is if perfection kind of continues to run the show, how do you imagine your future will go? And people it gets a little bit easier to take a position against perfection's effects on somebody's life, for example. So then the third stage is evaluating the problems and its effects. This is important. Like I said, are we really talking about the right problem? And these are some examples. Do you mind that this problem is doing these things? Is it okay with? Do you dislike it? Can you live with it? What would you like to be different? And those are all important questions to kind of gauge the severity of the problem that we're talking about, right? And their hopes for, like, if they don't want it to be there. And so this is the stage 4. I know I'm moving quickly, but we have limited time. But why do you not like having these effects? Can you explain to me the reasons? What specifically do you object to? And a lot of these questions, when we justify the evaluation, it leads us into a counter story. It leads us into what their hopes or preferences might be. And that leads us into an alternative story that can be built on to hopefully stand up against, and more stories, to stand up against the problem story that they've come in with. So, and I'm going to give you an example of this. I'll show you this, but so what should we listen for? And this is problem story to counter story. So when somebody's coming in and they're sharing problematic feelings, thoughts, and responses, and we're doing double listening, we're looking for what's being overlooked in these feelings. What feelings are being overlooked by the people maybe in the family, right? The intensity, of the problem. What's stalled? What intentions have been stalled? Why is it becoming so urgent? Why is it so loud now, right? Or identity stories. What are the preferred identities? If there's a problematic identity stories, what are preferred identities? Or the relational context. If there's a problem around the relational context? We're listening for? What are the relational preferences? And then power relations, which we're always dealing with, and what are resistances are we listening for? What values and hopes and preferences are grounded in those resistances that are happening? And then, of course, dominant discourses that we all are under the influence of. There's societal scripts that are all the shoulds that we all have to deal with, right? What are alternative discourses that folks are hoping to move into or live into that are being, obscured by these dominant discourses? And then, so this is the map. This is a version of the map, and Kara is going to have a handout where you're going to get Michael White's workshop notes, so you'll be able to read through some of this. So it's going to be helpful. But this is an example of this. And any Vygotskians in the room, you'll probably maybe might recognize this in some ways. But you see at the bottom it says known and familiar, and at the top it says possible to know. I know many of you are helpers, right? And I'm sure many of you, your friends come to you and ask you for advice, I bet. And how many times have you they're at this known and familiar at the bottom, and then you just point to this possible to know and you say, just do that, right? And how many times do they actually just do that? Well, they don't. And the reason is because it's too big of a leap. People need to be scaffolded through this developmental process. And I'm going to do a very quick elevator version of very theory, including some Vygotskian theory, which Michael White was influenced by. And this is the zone of proximal development that people need to be scaffolded through. And the way narrative therapy does that is through these questions that I just kind of ran through very quickly for you, right? Naming a problem, mapping its effects, evaluating it, and then justifying the evaluation. And this space between the known and familiar and the possible to know is liminal space, right? And what we're really doing in narrative therapy, I've come to realize what I really am is a liminal space tour guide. That's what I've come to understand myself as, right? That people that want change in their lives or in their families are required. There's no way escaping stepping into liminal space, and it can be very destabilizing. So when somebody experiences relapse or what gets characterized as self-sabotage, I've come to understand that that's really just a turning back in liminal space, right? Moving back to what is known and familiar. And I think narrative therapy really is about restoring agency, helping folks move through the liminal space of change, moving from the known and familiar to the possible to know. And that's why I like this little map here. And the way we do that in narrative therapy is through the questions and through, question development. So, and this is a second map. I won't go into it too much. But when you get to a counter story, characterization of initiative, you can do the same thing with a new intention or a new project or something they want to do. Let's name that new intention. And then you map that new intention. What will support this new intention? Who will support it? Who needs to know about this? Who can be your community of concern as you're moving through this new project? Do you like the idea of this new project? Do you like how it sounds? So you're doing the same thing kind of with a map, but that's a second map. So And then Kara was kind enough to add this. This talks about the therapeutic posture. Michael White was very interested in, oftentimes I think sometimes people think, well, since we're not like doing psychoed or we're not doing these things, we're very passive in narrative therapy. But I think narrative therapy actually isn't very passive. It's actually what Michael White would say, decentered but influential, and influential in the ways that our questions are trying to do things. Our questions are interventions, so to speak, right? And we are decentered because we try to decenter ourselves. We're not experts in people's lives. We trust that our families know what's best for them, that they just need to be reintroduced to their wisdom, knowledge, and skills that have been subjugated by problem stories, and that. But we are still very influential because our work is driven by questions, which are very influential. And so that's worth looking at if you can. And he was pretty clear about, like, if you're, centered and influential, if you're very centered, that can become very burdensome. If you're the answer grape for all your clients, you're going to be very prone to burnout, I think Michael White would say, right? And then, especially if you're centered and non-influential, you're going to be equally prone to a lot of burnout. So some of you that might be experiencing burnout might want to look at, like, what is your therapeutic posture in the room? Yeah, Nestor, I'll let you know books. We have that coming up. So anyway, here's my high-tech drawing of an externalized conversation with the families basically that you saw in the family you're going to see here in a minute. For example, I would interview, you have two parents there. And what do I want to say? So oftentimes, and you're going to recognize this, oftentimes when you're working with families, parents are experiencing worry and concern. And when I'm interviewing parents about the effects of worry and concern, typically the child or the young person can see that their parents aren't being a-holes, right? Or whatever, that they're actually under the influence of worry and concern. And it has them doing those things like removing privileges or putting the child under surveillance, those kinds of things that the child wants to go to, the young person wants to go away, right? And so when I'm interviewing them about them, I can turn to the young person and I can say, do you have any idea about how you can help them with this experience of worry and concern? And oftentimes the antidote to worry and concern is information, just information. And once they see that, they can step into, like, providing more information. And in that effort, it's a win-win for them, because then I can turn to the parents and say, if this young person attends to the worry and concern, what are you willing to do about privileges and surveillance and stuff? But under the overwhelming umbrella is, and we interview about this, tends to be mistrust, right? Mistrust of each other. And so this is a externalized view of how I kind of, like, I'm a visual person, like how I'm working, how I might work. And the family you're going to see in a second here, this is the work we did. The single mother, struggling with worry about her children. And this is basically the work that we did. So you weren't.
I wasn't giving them room before. But honestly, since they've gotten more room, it's just being aware of it and talking about it in counseling, being aware of the situation, giving them more space has made them make better choices. They're not getting, I get an hour out of the house, I'm gonna go get stoned, or, not like cramming things in. They're making better choices because they're getting rewarded for it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I'm always curious how you kind of weren't able to get there, and they always describe you having to pick them up, take them places, but now you've kind of been able to kind of maybe take a step back.
Well, I think
even under the even saying that worry and concern still sits out there.
I think we all had to take a step back. None of this is one-sided. Each one of us have put our own effort into it. But had we not had the opportunity to talk about it out open, none of us understood they just thought that I was, a real bitch and wouldn't let them do anything, which they didn't understand why. And, I looked at them as just being rude and inconsiderate, how dare you behave like that, until we all started to realize how basically life was affecting all of us in our own way and having to be respectful of how we all felt about things. So working more as a team and not against each other. That's kind of been the benefit.
Thank you, Kara.
Mhm.
Pull the slides back up. Thank you, Vanessa. So this is the final quote, and I think they captured it, that image, my high-tech image that they showed, and that, they were talking about being able to map the effects. They saw the effects that these things, what they called life, was having on each of them. And they, narrative is about bringing people together against problems, not against each other, right? And I think you saw how that played out. And I really like this last quote. And, I think we all had to take a step back. None of this was one-sided. Each one of us had to put our own effort into it, but we had not the opportunity to talk about it out in the open. None of us understood. They just thought I was a royal bitch and wouldn't let them do anything, in which they didn't understand why. And, I looked at them as just being rude and inconsiderate. How dare you behave like that? Until we all started to realize how basically life was affecting all of us in our own way and having to be respectful of how we felt about those things. So working more as a team and not against each other, that's kind of been the benefit. So that I think was a lovely way to end. And I want to tell a story. This video it's several years old, but I was contacted last year by that mother. Their father was a firefighter and died in the line of duty. And the mother reached out to me last year and asked me that her daughter asked her if she would ask me if I would marry her daughter. Her daughter was getting married, and so I did the service. So that was several years after, and that's one of the reasons I really like how narrative therapy positions me as a therapist, and that it does have this kind of effect, And the family work is hard. I understand it, and I know many of you are doing it, and it's challenging, but there's also those moments, right? And this was one of those moments for me, to get that call several years later and say, would you marry my daughter? She wants to know. So, and I did, and it was a beautiful ceremony. It was wonderful. So anyway, so some of the wrap up, we're in the wrap up phase. So, some of the questions I might have for you, what questions or lines require you, what might you take up that draws on a family's collective wisdom? How do you center the family's collective wisdom in the work that you do? And with the understanding of how families organize their identities through narrative, what might you do differently in your current work? And you don't have to have the answers now, but maybe those are some of the questions that I might leave with you today. And with that, resources. There's many more than these, but these are some of the ones that I just thought up and threw up there. Reauthoring Teaching, which is Peggy Sachs, and she's located in Vermont, but it's a global narrative therapy laboratory. So, and it's not that expensive, and they have stuff going on every month. You can participate. There's the Vancouver School of Narrative Therapy, which is run by Stephen Madigan, longtime narrative therapist, and they're having a conference coming up in October. I think it's towards the end of October. Vancouver's a wonderful city if you want to go do that. And then there's the Narrative Therapy Initiative, which is in Boston, probably not too far from many of you. And they have a lot of programming too that I can jump into, and that kind of thing. So, and then there's tons of books. Stephen Madigan wrote a great book called Narrative Therapy. The book I'm drawing on from this is Maps of Narrative Practice by Michael White. It's a recommended. I don't typically tell people to read that first if they're new to narrative therapy, but it is an amazing book if you want to do that. So I guess this in the time, we have a little bit of time left. Any questions I might be able to?
Yes, thank you so much. This is really wonderful. Somebody's asking, can you repeat the book? So
yeah, there's a book, Narrative Therapy. It's put out by the APA. That's written by Stephen Madigan, just narrative therapy. There's a narrative therapy book by Jill Friedman and Jean Combs, Combs. I would Google that. That's a great narrative therapy book. And then Maps of Narrative Practice by Michael White. I think you might find, like I said, I don't really suggest that as a first read, but make it a second read maybe.
And Vanessa's uploading the handouts that we mentioned.
Oh,
earlier.
wonderful. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. So please feel free to look
Yeah,
at
and
those.
grab that handout and read that. I think it's the notes Michael White would use for his workshops when teaching narrative therapy. And I think it's kind of very informative.
Yeah. Wonderful. Somebody chatted in earlier, and then I'll get it to your question, Brianna. How do you redirect away from blame and guilt when asking questions and working with families?
Well, it's probably very contextual to families, but I had a mentor of mine, Melanie, tell me one time that no good problem story lays down easy. So blame and those guilts kind of show up. I tend to not pick it up when it does show up, and I can tend to try to stay in my line of inquiry, like the questions that I'm having, with an understanding that the problem story is going to try to hijack the work that I'm doing. And I try not to get distracted by that when blame bombs are thrown or guilt shows up or those kinds of things. And I try to stay with my line of inquiry. I hope that helps.
And so you, so it's not like you deflect it, but you.
Yeah, Melanie has a question about recommend for narrative therapy with families for young children. There's a great book called Adventures in Wonderland by David Marston, David Epstein, and Lori Markham. And there's a practice in there called the Wonderfulnesses interview, which we use all the time at California Family Institute. And that book, for that chapter alone, is really, really worth it. It's a way to, when you're coming with a family with a young person, it's a way to situate the work right from the beginning in the way that you want to do it. And you start with what's called a Wonderfulnesses interview. And you can probably Google that and it might come up, but that book's well recommended.
Great, thank you. How do you invite clients into narrative therapy when they are weary of Western psychology?
Well, there's a lot of outside Western influences in narrative therapy. I'm thinking of somebody mentioned the Dulwich Center. Go to the Dulwich Center website, and there's all kinds of non-Western approaches to working from a narrative perspective that I think, dependent upon context and the family that you're working with, you might find very, very useful. I'm thinking of the Tree of Life practice, for example, or there's a rich resource at the Dulwich Center that are very much non-Western that you might be able to draw on.
Mm-hmm. Somebody mentioned the Dulwich Center, so thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And thank you, Mindy. Mindy just put in a link to the Wonderfulness interview guide. So thank you for
beautiful.
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Mindy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful, if you haven't done it, try it, experiment with it. It's a great way to situate the work right from the beginning.
Okay. How is it handled if there's a kid that functions more connectedly and a parent that functions more autonomously?
Well, I don't know. I'd have to see. I guess I would need more than that. I don't know. I would be very curious about both their experiences and the effects thereof, and how they influence the relationship between the two of them. I mean, I don't know, whatever that autonomously gets named by that person, or whatever that connectedness gets named by that person. You know, I'd be careful about pathologizing either position for sure, and just like be interested in their particular hopes or preferences of ways of being, and what are the effects on the relationship, and so each person can witness what that might be, and if people are interested in making some changes or that kind of thing, see what happens.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions that are coming up for any of you? Please chat them in. Can you spell the name of the center?
Yeah, Gabriella had it up there. I think it's DULWICH.
Oh,
and it's in Adelaide, Australia.
Okay. Great. Any other questions? Oh, when thickening the plot, how do you manage client nervousness or shyness about
Uh,
recruiting others?
Shyness about recruiting others into their stories, or
Yes.
yes, okay. Um, yeah, that's a great question. I'd be interested about um, what the nerve, I'm going to go the nervousness tells them about the world that waits for them, right? And what is does the nervousness shut down any possibility before you try, right? Which I imagine it does. And I imagine nervousness paints a bleak picture or worst case scenario or something like that. And yeah, I just think I would be curious about those effects and if they want to take a position on that and maybe do like what they imagine if nervousness wasn't present, what might they do differently?
Melanie, you read my mind. She was saying the externalizing of the problem reminds her of internal family systems. And one of my questions was, where does narrative therapy have a relationship within internal family systems therapy?
Uh, I think like in the sense of like the movie Inside Out, right, is a very great kind of externalization, and I know IFS probably references something like that pretty regularly too. I don't know the internal part we probably wouldn't mix, but I'm also a common factors research person, so I understand that like a lot of models, there's like aspects of them that appear very much similar in a way across all kind of approaches. And sure, I think internal family systems does use kind of an externalizing approach, and maybe a way that there is a commonality in that to narrative therapy, right?
Great. Have you used this approach with historically oppressed families and how the societal story has impacted the family's functioning?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's one of the things I've liked about, the thing I was drawn to drew me. When I started my grad program, I thought I was going to be an existential therapist. I thought meaning making was everything, right? And I was very interested in that. And so, but what I realized because of strong mentorship and just learning what I was learning, that I realized fairly quickly that not everybody's free to make meaning, that there are constraints to meaning making for folks, right? And that's why I was very interested in narrative therapy, because it did the meaning making thing that I was very interested in, but it was also very much attending to like all the isms, like the racisms and the sexisms and the all the things all the power operations that are operating on people's lives, right? And accounting for them, right, in a way that I thought was very, very important. So yeah.
Wonderful. How do you use, I think this could maybe our last question, and we might have time for one more if anyone has one, but how do you use narrative questioning during the intake and assessment process?
Yeah, so we created an intake. We threw at California Family Institute when we started. We had an intake because we just needed an intake, and then we threw it out and created a new intake that was grounded in my favorite book from grad school was Collaborative Therapy with Multi-Stress Families by Bill Madsen. If you haven't read that book, get that book. And in it, he does assessments and I think intakes from like a narrative therapy or a strengths-based or whatever perspective. And so some of you that are working in systems where some of that stuff is kind of problematic, maybe you can, do whatever, change, maybe make some change in the systems that you're in by maybe changing those intakes. So we very much created it. And somebody commented on our intake recently about like, it was very, very different than what they were used to. So I love those compliments, but yeah.
Can you mention the name of that book again? Somebody's asking.
Yeah. Collaborative Therapy with Multi-Stressed Families. William Madsen. He just recently passed away, unfortunately, but great guy. And he doesn't explicitly call himself a narrative therapist, but he's like a narrative therapist. But it's a very helpful book, especially those of you that are working in systems that are dealing with multi-stress families, right? I think you'll find that book a breath of fresh air, and it's very supportive in the work that you're doing.
Mhm. Wonderful.
Hmm.
Somebody add this last question. Thank you, Gabriella. What's been your favorite letter to write to a client?
Gabriella coming with the big questions. You know, the letter I think I'm most proud of, when I had to, actually the first family you saw, I had to write a letter for the son for the court, and him and I collaboratively wrote a letter together, making sure that his language was used in that letter, stating what he wanted the court to know. And I think that was probably the letter I'm probably most proud of, like collaboratively co-creating that letter with him, making sure that it wasn't done behind his back. We were doing it together, and he got to determine what was in that letter. And I appreciated that.
Wonderful. And Amanda saying, I really appreciate the collaborative pieces of this work.
Yeah.
Agreed, Amanda. And Gabriella says delightful.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everybody.
everyone. Thank you. Please, if you can, fill out our survey that will pop up when you leave our webinar. And because we do actually look at all of your feedback and appreciate it all. Here are our upcoming events. We have the DSM and development disorders of infancy and early childhood for our DC 0 to 5 work, an overview of early childhood professionals on Monday, August 14th. And then we are having some other great offerings in the works for the fall. So stay tuned, and thank you, Dr. Hoff. Once again,
Yeah.
it's a pleasure working with you.
Yes.
I
Same,
really,
Kara. Thank you.
yeah, I appreciate your liminal space guide metaphor. That's so beautiful. So maybe we can hear more about that another day.
Another
And
day. Yeah, I'd love to talk about liminal space all day long.
so great. All right. Have a great weekend, everyone, and take good care.
Thank you, everyone.